What is popping, guys? We're going through 5 players skyrocketing up the fantasy football rankings, starting off with player number 1. It's going to be Chris Olave. And I, as an Ohio State Buckeye fan, you see the Stroud, you see the Garrett Wilson jerseys. Chris Olave is that type of dude I am absolutely ecstatic for in 2024 fantasy football. Now, he's gone absolutely berserk when we're looking at his underdog value, shooting up 9 spots since April. But the big thing with Chris Olave is going to be the fact that, of course, you're a little bit concerned. Derek Carr is still the quarterback. When we're looking at guys in the similar range over here on underdog, we're looking at guys like Brandon Ayuk, who's got Brock Purdy, we've got Drake London, who got the improvement with Kirk Cousins / Michael Penix. We got Marvin Harrison Jr., who I know he's a rookie. I know there's a lot to be liking, but he does have Kyler Murray as his quarterback. So you're looking at yourself with Chris Olave and you're saying to yourself, well, Caleb, does he have the upside? Because I'm assuming he's going to get the targets. And when we look at him over on Player Profiler, we'll see last season, wide receiver 19 on a fantasy points per game basis. The year before that, wide receiver 25. Last year had 138 total targets for 87 receptions, 12.9 yards per reception, 1,800 air yards with 5 total receiving touchdowns. If we go down and look at the opportunity, how did he actually do with what was thrown his way? He was wide receiver 12 on targets with 138, had that wide receiver 17 on target share, wide receiver 18 on target rate. So there's a lot of good metrics that we do like with Chris Olave. The question then becomes, he's getting the ball thrown to him deep because he was wide receiver 6 on air yards, wide receiver 12 on air yard share, wide receiver 4 on deep targets. So as we talked about, we like to see those down the field catches, yak ability. The biggest thing for him, wide receiver 33 on the red zone opportunities. And we know that this Saints offense, we got Alvin Kamara, Kendre Miller, Jamal Williams in the backfield. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of weapons. The Saints are definitely going to be entering into a little bit of a rebuild because they've been in absolute cap hell the last few years. So for me, when I'm looking at Chris Olave, do I think he has the chance to actually blow up? Do I agree with him skyrocketing in underdog values? To be completely honest, I am not the biggest Chris Olave guy this year. I would much prefer getting a guy like Brandon Ayuk, getting a guy like Devontae Adams, who we've seen absolutely have elite level PPR production, even a guy like Nico Collins, who's a little bit cheaper than Chris Olave when I'm drafting drafts. So of course, I'm going to be drafting Chris Olave if the value is appropriate, but right now, he is skyrocketing up underdog rankings. So if you're in your drafts like you're drafting right now, Chris Olave, he might be a little bit of a hold for me. Don't necessarily love that he's skyrocketing in value, but I do understand why people are starting to give him that bump just based on the fact that they think that the third-year breakout, official breakout, because he has been solid, but the official, let's get him into the top 5 to 6 wide receivers on a points per game basis this year. I understand it. I just cannot agree with it. So I have Chris Olave as someone that I'm not really necessarily targeting, but he is skyrocketing up people's rankings. The second player that's skyrocketing up draft rankings right now is going to be DeVonta Smith. Not only does DeVonta Smith get that contract extension with the Eagles, he's now in an offense where, of course, Jason Kelce retired, but they brought in Saquon Barkley, and Howie Roseman had himself another elite level offseason as the GM for the Eagles. I'm not even an Eagles fan, and it's just, he seems like he's playing chess while all the other GMs are playing checkers. But when we're looking at DeVonta Smith, another guy that has gone soaring up the underdog ranks, he's up 10 spots if we're looking at his June ADP versus his ADP in April. So in 2 months, he's jumped up 10 total spots. I also understand that the redraft best ball community also really is tied into the dynasty community. And when we're looking at DeVonta Smith, of course, with that massive contract, a lot of people are like, hey, he's got the foundation. They view him clearly in their plans. They got to start getting him involved as this is his year 25 season. Last year, though, only 14.2 fantasy points per game, was the wide receiver 20 on that points per game basis with only 7 receiving touchdowns, 112 targets for 81 receptions. My biggest concern always with DeVonta Smith is not that he's small. That was the really big negative with him coming out of Alabama, his slim frame, but has always been, can he demand the target share that he's going to need in an offense with A.J. Brown, with this very solid running game to really help him propel into that top 10, top 12 wide receiver that you're going to need to be on a points per game basis for fantasy football. And I just don't see it when we're looking at wide receiver 23 on targets from last year, target share wide receiver 28. He was wide receiver 1 in snap share, so he's always out there playing. So we love to see that because he really was pretty healthy last season. We look at routes run, wide receiver 10, and route participation, wide receiver 1 as well. But really, when we start to get into like the efficiency metrics, when we're looking into the overall his zone versus man, it's okay numbers, but I just would love to see DeVonta Smith really step up and overtake and have a chance to be the clear 1B instead of like the 2 to A.J. Brown's 1A predominantly. I just think at this current cost at wide receiver 19, when we're looking at DeVonta Smith, I don't know if I can get behind it because we got him ahead of guys like DJ Moore, who's getting that quarterback upgrade from Justin Fields to Caleb Williams. We have DK Metcalf, who's spot below Stephon Diggs, who gets an improved situation. I would love love to say that DeVonta Smith has similar upside to those guys, but he really doesn't, in my opinion. So DeVonta Smith rising up boards. I am not necessarily on the bandwagon of that skyrocketing value, but all of you best ball drafters are pushing him up the boards. So definitely hits the player skyrocketing up rankings right now as we are in June. Next player we're going to be talking about is going to be Zay Flowers. And when we're looking at Zay Flowers, clear wide receiver 1 for the Baltimore Ravens. And the thing that we love to see with Zay Flowers, he's gone up 12 spots since April. He's steadily climbing that ADP. And I don't necessarily think that's because people are worried about him being overtaken by Mark Andrews. Not at all. Everyone can see that both these guys are going to eat. And after free agency, after the NFL draft, them really not adding any serious competition and letting OBJ walk in free agency, this is time to shine for Zay Flowers. Now, I've been on the Zay Flowers train all offseason. So I'll tell you right now, I think it's valid why his price is increased. I mean, last year, wide receiver 31, 12.9 fantasy points per game was where he finished. But if we're actually taking a look at his game log, we're going to see once Mark Andrews ended up leaving with that injury, we're talking about a guy that had week 12, 23 fantasy points, 20 fantasy points in week 14. In week 16, had 22.2 fantasy points per game, 19.6 fantasy points per game in week 17. And then in week 21, which is, of course, in the playoffs versus Kansas City, he had 20.9 fantasy points in that playoff game. And so what you're going to be saying to me is like, Caleb, what really happened? Really, that snap share absolutely took off. He was like on the field almost every down the Baltimore Ravens were throwing the ball. And that's what makes me really excited for Zay Flowers is we're only going to start to see these metrics really start to take off because we're looking at him wide receiver 26 in targets, wide receiver 20 in target share, wide receiver 41 in target rate. There's so much room for improvement. And I think when we started to really see him start to come on, like I said, in these end games, we're talking about him as an absolute target machine. Week 12 had 8 targets, 14 targets, 10 targets in week 14, 13 targets in week 16. And even if he didn't get the targets, he was like a touchdown away from being an absolute game wrecker for you. And now I know I said that like Chris Olave had more targets and I didn't love his price. Right now, Zay Flowers is the wide receiver 25 on Underdog, going behind guys like Michael Pittman Jr., Cooper Kupp, Stephon Diggs, DK Metcalf. And to be completely honest with you, I love Zay Flowers a lot more than those guys. So I actually love that his price is skyrocketing because I think it's gotten appropriately valued right now. I think it's a little bit still undervalued. So I'm going to continue to draft Zay Flowers each and everywhere that I can. Absolutely love some Zay Flowers in fantasy football for 2024. My fourth player skyrocketing up fantasy football rankings is Jonathon Brooks, who gets drafted in the second round to the Carolina Panthers. And when we're looking at Jonathon Brooks, pretty much since April, he's come up 30 total spots. Now that is really due to the fact that he landed on the Carolina Panthers in the second round. We saw what Dave Canales could do with Rachaad White last season. And then we're seeing Jonathon Brooks, and a lot of people are projecting him as the clear starter in this Carolina Panthers backfield. The thing is, a lot of people are not remembering the fact that our guy, Jonathon Brooks, tore that ACL last year for the University of Texas. And so really is projected to probably maybe not be ready even for week 1 of the regular season. Now, I am not saying that Jonathon Brooks could be a league winner in fantasy football because I think when you're talking about this new revamped Carolina Panthers offense, there's all the ability for Jonathon Brooks to come in and seize the opportunity. We saw Chuba Hubbard, for instances, have some flashes. Of course, Miles Sanders, the corpse of it, is still there in the backfield for the Carolina Panthers. But Jonathon Brooks, for me, I just cannot get behind this current value. When we're talking about him, like behind, he's RB23 on Underdog, behind a guy like Zamir White, ahead of guys like DeAndre Swift, Jalen Warren, Zach Moss, if you do need that running back help. But there are some wide receivers, values, tight ends, like a Jake Ferguson, in the same range where I'm just not excited about Jonathon Brooks. He didn't work out at the combine, but based on previous measurements, a 4.5 40-yard dash. He had a 72nd percent speed score, 6 foot, 216, 20 years old. So I just cannot get over the fact that we're drafting this guy who's not fully 100% healthy, and he just continues to get boosted up the rankings. I know if we're talking dynasty, whole different story on Jonathon Brooks, but right now in our redraft Underdog formats, I just don't like Jonathon Brooks soaring up the rankings, just making me not want to select him in these best ball drafts. And my final player that's skyrocketing up rankings, and I'll be clear, I think this guy appropriately is skyrocketing up, is going to be Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel slides in at wide receiver 50, and he's gone up 17 spots since April. Of course, that comes to the fact that the Buffalo Bills really did not address the wide receiver position much more than adding Keon Coleman. And we had Stephon Diggs getting traded away, which then opens up just such a large target share and a lot of question marks in this Buffalo Bills offense when we're talking talking about Dalton Kincaid's probably the clear one. Is Keon Coleman going to play on the outside? What's going to be happening with Curtis Samuels? A little bit more of a gadget back. The good news with this whole situation is the fact that Josh Allen is the starting quarterback for the Buffalo Bills. So we know that the offense, even if it is a little bit lackluster just due to the overall weapons that are on this offense, I think Curtis Samuel could have a role. And more importantly than that, I think Curtis Samuel could have a big role. I mean, when we're looking at him the last 2 years, 2022, 10.4 fantasy points per game was the wide receiver 44. 2023, wide receiver 48 with 9.8 fantasy points. But you got to remember, he's playing in the Washington Commanders offense behind Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. And to be clear, I think Curtis Samuel, when he has had those flashes, he's absolutely electric. We're talking about a guy that has a 4.3 40-yard dash, 5'11", 196, 27 years old. And I know he's a Buckeye, so you're going to say, Caleb, there's a little bit of bias involved here. But he is entering the absolute prime of his career. And as much as we loved when Stephon Diggs got traded from the Minnesota Vikings to the Buffalo Bills, I'm not saying Curtis Samuel signing with the Buffalo Bills is that same exact thing, because Curtis Samuel, Stephon Diggs, at their certain points in their career, totally different. But I think that same little bump that happened with Stephon Diggs when he actually went and played with an elite level quarterback, I think that same bump could happen to Curtis Samuel, because there was weeks, I mean, last season started off really hot for fantasy football. Week 1, 11 fantasy points. Week 4, 18 fantasy points. 18 fantasy points in week 5. In week 6, had 14 fantasy points. We go all the way down to week 12, had 19 fantasy points, 21 fantasy points in week 15. We saw the absolute explosion. So especially in best ball formats, Curtis Samuel is a dude that I think is appropriately being valued. I think he could be a game wrecker for fantasy football in 2024, but especially if we're talking for our redraft leagues, trying to project where these guys are going to land at the current ADPs that are happening right now in the middle of June. Absolutely think Curtis Samuel's ascension over the last 2 months has been appropriate. So let me know what you think of these players skyrocketing up rankings. We're putting out a ton more fantasy football content. We're going 5 videos this week. We will also be doing a live draft with Lucas from the Fantasy Football Fellas this week, so be tuning in for that. But I appreciate all you guys for tuning in. Hit that like and subscribe button if you like redraft fantasy football, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.